Another way of looking at this issue, more from the perspective of something working in the trenches of policymaking, is to ask the question, so when does an issue come up on the policy agenda? And one very helpful guide to thinking about that comes from the work of John Kingdon, who talks about how agendas get set. And Kingdon says something like this. If you want to think about how policy issues come on the agenda, you have to take into account 3 different kinds of streams. So he calls these the problem streams, which is how do we come to define something as a problem? And there's a range of different ways that happens. Right? Sometimes people just collect indicators. Like we want to know what the infant mortality rate is. We want to know what the unemployment rate is. And if there's suddenly a big spike, then we think there's a real problem. Right? In the United States, if you go back 2 decades, maybe you have to go back 3 decades, the rates of morbid obesity in this country were something like 15% or less, and today more than a third of the country faces that problem and has all sorts of consequences in terms of heart disease, obesity, and so on. Just by collecting that data, we know that there's a real problem. Sometimes it requires some kind of focal event, like some kind of major crisis. It could be an earthquake, it could be a meltdown of financial markets. Something major happens that tells us that there's a problem. And sometimes it's just built-in feedbacks. Once we pass a policy, we kind of keep monitoring what's happening, and by taking that kind of feedback, we can figure out when there's a problem. Then there's a second stream that's a stream of policies, right? There's always policies around. Everybody thinks that they know how to improve education. Everybody thinks they know how to get better access to healthcare. Everybody thinks they have a better solution to the digital divide. There's always all sorts of policies around. And the question is, how do you decide which policy to pick between? And the range of things, some policies, I'm sorry, that's not as visible. Some policies are simply technically infeasible. So that helps to filter out some kinds of policies over others. Some policies really don't work for the particular country context that you're in, or the local context that you're in. So values sometimes matter, and some policies are better able to anticipate what's likely to happen in the future or not. So there's a range of things that happen that are characteristic of policies themselves. And then finally, Kingdon says there's also a political stream. Right? The country may not be in the mood right now for large-scale infrastructure projects because of a lot of insecurity about where the economy is. That's something about the national mood. Organized interest, that's about different entities that manage to coalesce their interest into some sort of articulated, organized voice, and those help shape what you can and can't do. Sometimes if the regime and government switches, then you go from not being able to do anything on an issue to actually being able to tackle that issue. And then bargaining space is just a different way of saying, depending on what's going on in the country, you can either push in one issue or you can't push in one issue. And the metaphor which Kingdon uses is there are, when these 3 streams converge, it's really kind of like being out in the Pacific Ocean on a surfboard and waiting for the perfect wave. When you see the perfect wave, you better be ready to ride it. So policy entrepreneurs are the key people for Kingdon. There are people who've worked long and hard on an issue. They think they know what the right way to get the country or your state or your local government to a better place than that issue is, and they're waiting for the right moment. They're waiting for that perfect wave. And the wave comes when these 3 streams converge. When suddenly people get a sense that there's a problem, there happens to be policies that are explicitly targeted to that problem, and the national mood and the regime and the bargaining space is right to actually do something on it. In the U.S. context, you might think about 2009 and Barack Obama's election and being able to pass some kind of healthcare legislation as being that kind of convergence of 3 different streams. Now, one thing I'm going to return to is the particular role of citizens activating public opinion in this process. They can kind of feed into each one of these processes, right? They can feed into it by being keen on what kind of information is out there. And I'm going to talk about the role of framing and organization and leadership and so on. But they have a role to play